So I'm going to go ahead and call this first work session to order on AO 2020-66, authorizing the acquisition by purchase or lease with option to purchase of real property. Let's go ahead and do a roll call.
Mr. Rivera.
Present.
Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Here.
Ms. Allard.
Here.
Mr. Constant.
Here.
Mr. Dunbar.
Here.
Ms. Kennedy. Ms. LaFrance. Mr. Perez-Verdia.
Here.
Mr. Peterson. Mr. Weddleton. Ms. Zalatel.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Great, thank you. So I do see that Ms. LaFrance is in our participant list, so maybe she's just having a difficulty with the audio. And then Ms. Kennedy did tell me that she was going to be on the phone, so she should be joining in soon. Oh, great, thank you. So as usual, members, if you could please either put yourself in the chat to get in the queue or text me. I'm sorry, who is that? Okay, sorry, I'm hearing voices, so if we can make sure that we're muted if we're not speaking, please. So yes, so assembly members, please chat me to get in the queue or text me to get in the queue. We have 1 hour for today, and like I introduced, this is the first work session, so we have a second work session scheduled on July 10th, assuming we're going to need it. Just seeing that we have 1 hour, we're likely not going to be taking audience participation at this work session. We usually don't take audience participation, but perhaps at the second one, if we have time, we will. With that, I will turn it over to the administration. I don't know, Mr. Bockenstad, if you are kicking us off.
I am. Thank you very much, and I will try to take control of or share my screen. I will just mention that this has been a team effort on behalf of the administration, and I know that a number of folks are online, including Chris Schutte, Nancy Burke, Nicole Lebo, Robin Ward, and others that will likely participate and make comments throughout. But let me see if I can't get my screen to work. Let's see if that's the right one.
I can see your screen.
You can? Okay, great. Well, as you mentioned, we're here today to talk about AO 2020-66, an ordinance that would authorize the acquisition by purchase or lease with option to purchase real property. Let's see. Essentially, just very broadly, AO 2020-66 would allow us to purchase property to create a treatment center to help people with substance misuse problems, bridge and permanent supportive living spaces, daytime engagement centers and social services for those experiencing homelessness, and additional overnight shelter space for those experiencing homelessness. So AO 2020-66 was introduced by the mayor along with Assembly members Zalatel and Constant. It is requesting $22.5 million for the acquisition and renovation costs of 4 properties that we'll get into. But before we dive into that, I did want to just take a step back and discuss just briefly why we're in this position and why we are proposing this. And essentially, if you look at where we have been in previous years with the shelter capacity that we had in Anchorage prior to COVID, between all of these locations that we have on our screen, we had roughly 688 shelter beds in Anchorage. As a result of COVID and the necessary reduction, or I guess more appropriately, the increase in the amount of physical distancing that is recommended by CDC and others, you can see what it has done to the amount of actual capacity that we have in these locations. We are almost 400 beds short just based on what we had last year. And that is the real reason why the administration spent a lot of time looking at possible locations. And obviously, over the last several months, we have set up both Ben Boeke and the Sullivan for shelter, meal distribution, showering, and then obviously the Dempsey was also set up as a quarantine and isolation facility. We have set up resource hubs in the parking lot. We have been successful in completely demobilizing both the Ben Boeke and the Dempsey Anderson arenas and have returned those to their service as hockey rinks. However, the Sullivan Arena is still being used as the additional overnight shelter capacity. And I will just reiterate that prior to us being able to fully get out of the Sullivan Arena, we need a solution to handle the previous slide where we are 400 beds short with the amount of capacity that we had just last year.
Before you go on, Jason, just want to note, Ms. Alisel made a comment that the document is not yet up on the website. So I think it likely, I don't think it was emailed to the clerk's office before the presentation, right, Jason?
I emailed it to the clerk's office about 15 or 20 minutes ago, so it was
Okay.
It was a little late arriving, but yes, they have it now.
Perfect. Well, then we will make sure that this gets put up on the website as soon as possible for members of the public to view. Go ahead.
And I guess I'll take a second and just give anyone else that is on the administration side a chance to say any additional comments on the Boeke or Sullivan before I move on, if I've missed anything. I take silence that I did not, so I'll just move on. So coming back to AO 2020-66, again, $22.5 million for 4 different properties, and I'm going to run through those and discuss those. The first is the former Alaska Club on Tudor and Gamble. The proposed use that we have for this is a daytime engagement center providing case management and other client services, as well as using it as an overnight shelter. And just some information on what this is. It's Zone B3. Obviously, the current use is a fitness and recreational sports, but we will, the proposed use in the short term is a social service facility, and in the long term, a homeless and transient shelter. And I do want to just take this moment to say that as we go through this, a lot of the terms that we are using when we say proposed use, we are pulling directly from municipal code. So the terminology that we're using here might be a little bit different than folks are using in the, or I would say that folks that typically look at this with from our partners' perspective, or our homeless coalition partners might be using slightly different terms, but we wanted to make sure that we were actually using the terms directly pulled from municipal code so people understood why we were using those terms. But again, this is the former Alaska Club, long-term homeless and transient shelter, and then a map of where this is. It's obviously right there on Tudor in between Fairbanks Street and Gamble Street. The second is the America's Best Value.
Actually, Jason, before we move on, I have a couple questions on that
Sure.
first property, and I guess just a point of clarification. So, is your presentation going to go into more detail on each of these properties?
We will talk a little bit in more detail, but I'm happy to stop and answer any questions that people have.
Yeah,
Or if I don't know them,
these...
I will punt them to the people that do.
Perfect. So I'll go ahead and start with Mr. Constant.
Thank you. Jason, on this slide here talks about restriction of behavioral health counseling from occurring. And I want to make sure we are looking closely at that very specific prohibition, because it might in fact be a barricade that keeps these programs from becoming less harmful over time. And so I definitely want us to look at that.
Okay, Chris, Shooty, do you have any response to that?
No, I apologize. I didn't hear the full comment.
Just that if you look at the slide under this section of code, there is a prohibition on behavioral health counseling happening. Essentially, that may be a barricade to the successful operation of these programs. And so I would like us to include that specific item in our conversation about going forward with any code changes related to these shelters.
Thank you.
Okay.
Ms. Zolta?
Thank you. Mr. Constant highlighted, to use social service facility, is that really a good match for day engagement or resource hub, as we've been discussing? So I definitely want to make sure we've got that flagged. Can we, as you know, the public is really interested in this. They're going to be having the opportunity for public hearing on the 14th of July. Can we talk a little bit about what short-term and long-term mean, as we not, I don't need dates, but kind of put some parameters around those words as we move through this?
Sure, I'll take a crack at it, and maybe Robin Ward can jump in after. But to actually there will be a number of renovations required for this building to get it to a spot where we can actually use it as a homeless and transient shelter, that include sprinklering the building, putting in, I believe, additional restrooms, things like that. So in the short term, for a day engagement center, it is our understanding that it works almost immediately. So we could, get that up and running relatively quickly. But there will be a need for additional renovations that obviously take time. So I don't want to kind of put a date on how long those will take, but obviously longer than just getting it up and running as a day engagement center. Robin, did I get that mostly right?
Yes, this is Robin Ward. That is correct. The only thing that we cannot do in the engagement center is the actual mental health counseling, but all of the referrals, everything basically that we are doing in the resource hub today, we can do there under the social services. What we cannot do is any kind of actual mental health counseling or overnight transient shelter. Because it's B3, we would have to see if the B3 ordinance goes through and allows it to be an allowed zoning district with a conditional use. If not, we would have to look at rezoning the property to public lands and institutions, PLI, in order to use it as a transient shelter.
Mr. Chair, if I might.
I have someone else in the queue. Okay, if I don't see anything else from Ms. Alatel, Mr. Whittleton?
Sorry. I guess a number of questions on this one is, this question is, how big is it? Is it big enough to contain all those 400 people? And then continue the discussion a bit on what services can be there. Can behavioral health counseling not be in B3? I mean, is it allowed as kind of a accessory use? And then who would operate it?
Mr. Rattleton, this is Robin Ward. It would take, I'm going to have to go back to the Title 21 code to find out, but I believe it takes a conditional use to do mental health counseling. The property is large enough to house at 6 feet apart, approximately 150 overnight, but it would not accommodate all of them.
That big building can only handle 150 people?
Unless you took the engagement center out every day and put cots in at night, we might be able to expand it another 40 to 50 cots.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Constant?
Thank you. I don't see how your framing of this, Ms. Ward, is accurate. So what you just said is we couldn't do these things because of zoning and the code. But we have already an operating emergency shelter going on in B3, or very close to it, which is the Hope Center. And so we know that the administration has the emergency power, and we also have the emergency shelter code, in which these uses could go in at any time, according to the mayor, as long as we have an emergent need, like no place for people to sleep. And so, in my opinion, the way we need to frame this whole transformation is not we're going to buy these buildings and then one day we're going to get to where we have the services we want after we change the code to we're going to buy these properties. We're going to put in the basic services that we need under the emergency because that's what we have. And then we're going to do whatever we need to do to amend the code to make it safe for neighborhoods to have these facilities in them. That's the model that I think we need to approach this at, not that everything must be perfect before day one. Because if we're going to do that, then none of this actually makes any sense, and we are going to stay with the Sullivan Arena. That's at least the big picture that I see here.
Assemblymember Constant, this is Jason. I think we all agree with you on that. I think the shelter aspect of it will be difficult in the near term, just because, as I mentioned, I think there are going to be a number of renovations that are going to be required that are just not going to allow people to be in that area until that is finished. So we can go through kind of the process that you have outlined for that aspect of it prior to it potentially being ready for that. But everything else, I think we very much agree with you.
Thank you. I don't have any other questions. Please continue.
And I would mention that obviously Robin did mention it, but we believe that roughly 150 individuals will be able to stay there based on the 6 feet of physical distancing that is going to be recommended. And from our perspective, we actually don't think that that is ever going to go away. So this is just another reason why thinking that we can get out of the Sullivan without having additional properties is just going to result in us staying in the Sullivan for much longer than we have all probably already liked.
Mr. Chair, just a quick follow-up on that. And if I might, Jason, there was never any intent of recreating a 400-bed shelter anywhere ever again, right?
Correct.
Can you speak on that for a minute?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would just say that, you know, obviously you look at one of the previous slides that I had in terms of where have we historically had our shelter capacity, and roughly 400 were on the Beans and Brother Francis campus. And because of COVID and 6 foot of physical distancing, that is never going to happen again. And it is unrealistic for anyone to have, you know, thoughts that at some point we'll ever be able to get close to that. At really any campus, I would venture to guess. So that is why we have looked at multiple locations where we can have somewhere in the neighborhood of 125 to 150 individuals. We also believe that it will be easier for us to find providers and manage the population in a way that is much safer for the surrounding areas. And yeah, so did that answer your question?
I think it did fairly enough, just so everybody recognizes we're not aiming to recreate a massive shelter.
Thank you. Before you go on, Jason, Mr. Gates?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a question about the planned near term and then longer term uses. And as I understand it, in the Civil Emergency Chapter of Code, Section 38110, there's the exemption from zoning regulations during an emergency, and that was applied and used to set up the mass shelter at Sullivan, even though it's not a PLI district. Is that right? And then the follow-on to that is, well, why can't the same, I guess, exception be used for this Midtown Alaska Club and the other properties, even in the near term? It sounded like you wanted the near term to be compliant with Title 21 zoning regulations, and after changes to the B3 district are made, allowing homeless transit shelters to do the long-term change. But you know, the section I mentioned, 38110, allows that exemption from zoning regulations for up to 2 years. So is there some other reason that we couldn't, I guess, or the administration couldn't use these properties for homeless transit shelters sooner rather than later?
Through the chair, this is Chris Schutte, Director of Economic and Community Development. I'll take the question. Part one of the question was about the current use at the Sullivan Arena as a temporary emergency shelter, and Mr. Gates absolutely identified it correctly. It's a power afforded to the administration under the current emergency, and that was the way in which we were able to stand up that particular facility quickly. The second part of his question, which was also the same question asked or same point made by Assemblymember Constant, is about utilizing that same emergency shelter provision to transition immediately into overnight shelter at the Midtown Alaska Club. That is absolutely an option, but one of the reasons that we have proposed it in this fashion to the Assembly and to the public is that essentially it feels better to do it this way. This is the channel that, or the process that would unfold for this facility to go through acquisition and then renovation to become eventually a transient shelter, is to immediately fire up the current legally available by right services under Title 21 so that we can utilize it for a needed resource hub or day shelter immediately, and then transition it into a long-term overnight transient shelter as well.
Yeah.
Ultimately, if there's the desire and need to instantly transform it into overnight congregate shelter, the emergency shelter provisions do give us the legal authority to do it. But we're proposing it in this fashion because this is sort of the existing non-emergency channels to propose it.
Thank you, Mr. Schutte. It does sound like going through the usual process is more respectful to the land use regulations and the neighboring properties and so forth. I appreciate the explanation.
Thanks. So I'm going to go ahead and go through one more time for folks in the queue, and then I want to make sure we save time for the other three properties. So Mr. Weddleton. You're on mute, Mr. Weddleton.
Hi. Come on. You know, just on the comments of sounds with some gusto that we would not have large homeless shelters and only 125, and I don't think we should discount having large homeless shelters. You know, I've seen some. Pine Street Inn was over 500 people, and you could not tell that was a homeless shelter. It's very effective, and it was effective not on sheltering, but on getting people up and out of poverty. The places I saw in Omaha, the Sienna House had, I don't know how big it was, but it was hundreds. And the open door mission in Omaha had over 700 beds, and that was some for overnight emergency shelter, all the way up to transitional housing as they moved on and up to work and independent life. What you get with the larger operation is you have economies of scale. You can get more services in there. You know, I think having several that are, 100 something, 125, 150 to meet this 400 would be extremely expensive to do. And I think we're very wrong to say that's like a cap. We should not let what we do be guided by the disaster we have down at 3rd Avenue. That's an outlier. We can and will do better. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Zolotel.
Thank you. So similar to the concerns about bringing on this kind of piecemeal, I am a little bit concerned if we bring it on as day shelter or what the rationale would be, given that we have stood up the Sullivan and have a resource center there. I'm concerned about neighborhood impacts with people coming and going, especially if we don't have transportation. That's one of the big issues that's plagued us at 3rd Avenue is the coming and going of clientele. So I just want to flag the issue as we move through that, because it's an absolute necessity that we think about what that would look like.
Thank you. Mr. Constant?
I deeply appreciate John's optimism, and back to the previous point, that if we are going to use this social service facility section of the code, then I do believe we should post haste begin the process to remove that section on behavioral health counseling. Everything else is fine. The reason why is because if those services are allowed to be there, then people can actually be there and be getting better and not just go running out the door when they're having an extreme crisis. And it might actually help these operations pay for their ongoing services.
Thank you. All right, Jason, please continue.
All right. So the next
Sorry
property.
about that. I have one more person in the queue, and then we'll move on. Mr. Dunbar.
Okay.
Thank you. Just a real quick question on the point that Chris just made for the attorneys. Let's say we did want to do that and excise that one piece of the code. Could that be an amendment to the B3 ordinance that is going forward, or would that violate the single subject rule? Because it seems of a piece, but I'd like a legal opinion on that.
Are you looking for a legal opinion right now, Mr. Dunbar?
Well, I mean, if someone has one, that'd be great. If it's a simple no, then that's fine. But if it's a maybe, that's interesting too.
So this, Mr. Chairman, this is Chris Schutte. I'll speak to it from the zoning amendment process. Mr. Dunbar, through the chair to Assemblymember Dunbar, I do think that there's two issues at hand here. One is whether or not there is strict interpretation of what is identified as allowable uses in the zoning code versus what nomenclature is used in the social service arena. This is something that we have found can be very confusing. And so to the points about behavioral health services and what it does or does not include, there is a degree of variability in how that language is interpreted if you're a social service provider versus a land use reviewer. So it's not a perfect description or limitation in my mind of the services that could be available at the site. So I'd ask the Assembly to bear that in mind. Secondly, to the point about amending the B3 ordinance to address a different section of code, I think that discussion will unfold in greater detail tomorrow at the follow-up meeting to the CEDC meeting on that B3 ordinance. And my recollection is that the B3 ordinance is taking a different, more holistic approach that could perhaps incorporate comments like this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Go ahead, Jason.
Thank you. And as I'm moving on, I did want to just mention, I don't know if we answered one of Assemblymember Weddleton's questions about who would operate this facility. That is still a TBD. We would, for almost all of these facilities, have to go through the RFP process to find who the ultimate operator of the facility would be. So the next property on the list is the America's Best Value Inn and Suites on Lakeshore and Spenard. Again, the proposed use is a form of transitional housing while tenants take steps to try to get into permanent supportive housing, which we could also use a portion of this facility for that as well. Again, there would likely be case managers and on-site assistants for all of these. And again, just some basic information on it. It is, again, Zone B3. And current use is obviously a hotel motel, but we would be proposing it as a transitional living under the code. And again, I just want to point out that that is the terminology that we are pulling strictly from our code. It's probably different than how others would refer to it as. I've heard it a number of different ways: rapid rehousing, bridge housing, things like that. But we wanted to make sure that we were using the terminology in our code. And again, this facility, we are looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 to 160 in a variety of different room setups. I'll stop before we move on to see if there are questions from members.
Great. Mr. Constant.
Thanks, Jason. I have heard along the lines of this property in particular, there might be some substantive repairs and kind of some challenges with the building. And I had another question that I don't know the answer to this. I assume the answer is no, but are we going to have to go through a change of use process for this building to get it to be this use, or is there some way to make it fit?
I think on the first question, I will punt that question to Robin Ward, who probably has a lot more detailed knowledge on that. And then on your second piece on the zoning issue, I will likely phone a friend and ask Chris Schutte to help out on that one.
This is Robin Ward, Real Estate Director. The property is an older property. There are two buildings. They were both built in the 70s in different years. The property is actually in fairly good shape. It is operating currently as a hotel. Almost half of the units have kitchens or kitchenettes in those, but we feel that it would currently be able to be used as transitional housing and overnight, along with some meeting space that would be utilized as a resource hub. It will take renovations in the future, but at least today it is able to be used almost immediately.
And then Mr. Schutte on the second question.
Yes, sorry, I was giving my response while on mute. So I believe, Mr. Constant, your question was, does it require a change of use to convert the America's Best executive suites into the transitional living? And the answer is no. And if I misheard your question, please.
That's a
please
great
repeat
answer. No, that's a great answer. I want to hear that answer. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. I don't see anyone else in the queue, so we can move on.
Okay, and again, just a map showing exactly where it is, right there on Lakeshore and Spenard. Next property is the Beans Building on 3rd and Carluck. This would be proposed use of looking at building a daytime engagement center, providing case management for the remaining individuals that are using the Brother Francis shelter. And again, same information. B3, just we actually own the land, they own the building. Wouldn't necessarily result in any big change in terms of the current use or proposed use. It would still stay as a social service facility, but it would no longer provide overnight shelter.
Thank you. Ms. Zolotel.
Thank you. Mr. Buxted, how does this work? So with the reconfiguration with COVID, I know that Brother Francis has reduced its census, but is also doing its own on-site food. Is there enough space between for it all, I guess is the way I'm asking it. Is there enough space? My understanding is Brother Francis is bringing in food and doesn't have any space to do it on site. Would that be part of this, or would this possibly be completely separate daytime engagement from the Brother Francis operations?
I might ask Nancy to help me with that, but my understanding is that, again, I think we would try to work with the Brother Francis shelter and everyone that's down there to figure out how we can make the highest and best use of this additional space. And if that means that whatever we put out for an RFP includes some of the things that you mentioned, I think we're certainly open to that, but I will let maybe Nancy provide a little bit more context on that.
Thank you. Through the chair, I think those are all the questions that need to be held with Beans Cafe. They're definitely interested in advancing the model that's been in use. But this building has been a pretty integral part of their operation, so they would have to have their needs covered in a different way moving forward. So those are all the right questions for us to be focusing on going forward. But it is a large building, and I believe there's enough space to do the things that are being discussed.
Thank you.
Any other questions on this property before we move on? All right, I'm not seeing any. Go ahead.
Again, just a map. I think everyone probably already knows where exactly where this is. And then the final location is the Best Western Golden Lion. This is the property on 36th and Seward Highway that we are looking at as a potential drug and alcohol treatment center that would have some step-down housing after individuals finish the program. And again, basic information, it is Zone B3, and the proposed use would be under the habilitative care facility with 26 or more residents. And again, a lot of the details on the exact number of beds would come as we are going through the renovation process and working with the eventual provider and operator of the facility.
The other one looks great with what you have on, but so does this.
Thank you. Ms. Zolotel?
Thanks. So would this require a change of use? And then when we talk about this in terms of drug and alcohol treatment, can you talk with us a little bit about what that might look like in terms of where that particular part or whatever is envisioned here for treatment fits within the overall scheme of kind of what services are available in town and on our previous conversations about an Alaska treatment center?
Sure, absolutely. I'll let, I think Chris probably answer your first question on the zoning side.
Yeah, I apologize. Assemblymember Zolotel, can you repeat the zoning question? I was focused on the second half.
Sure. Thanks, Mr. Schutte. Does it require a change of use for this property?
Oh, understood. No, it does not. And then I'm not prepared to answer your second half of your question. I believe that would be Mr. Bockenstedt.
Yeah, so essentially, I think as most of the assembly should be aware, and probably a lot of the public, we have talked about the need for additional substance abuse treatment beds for a very long time. We have talked about this out at the old Clitheroe site. What we have always intended for the treatment or the Alaska Center for Treatment is some sort of a mix of outpatient, intensive, outpatient, and some obviously with the inpatient, some residential treatment on the American Society of Addiction Medicine level 3.3. That is currently care that is not provided by any facility in the entire state. So it is obviously, from our perspective, a need. The center would include complementary, supportive services, independent living, social integration skills training, peer support, sober stabilization, and things like that. So, not sure if that answers your question, but happy to give you another shot at seeing if I did.
May I ask a quick follow-up, Mr. Chair?
Sure.
Thanks. Would this facility be intended to serve individuals beyond those experiencing homelessness?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton.
Thanks. A couple following up on that. And Jason, I missed how many patients you anticipate and then how long. It was detox and then 8 to 12 months or something of kind of recovery. And then also, I thought that the South Central Foundation is looking at expanding their operation down at Tudor and Elmore to basically do the same thing. And is this, do we need this if they do that? And would we need this if Clitheroe were open? I say Clitheroe, the new one out there by the airport.
Well, I think to answer your last question first, this would be the replacement for Clitheroe. And on some of the other questions related to what South Central Foundation is potentially doing and how that would interact with what this facility would be, I would ask Nancy Burke to provide some response to that.
Thank you. Through the chair, the intent of the project located on West End Road near the airport was to address the failing building that Clitheroe has operated out of for many years. Clitheroe remains a viable program. Salvation Army is our close partner. And will likely continue providing those services under the new configuration of the 1115 behavioral health waiver. So these are all part of the conversations that will need to happen is where will that go when we're not able to keep the building open? Who will operate out of this building? There's been a group of providers that have provided input to us on what would best serve the needs of the community in terms of gaps. The municipality is interested in supporting the gaps that we see. And so it's the next step for the health department, and Nicole Lebo is leading this, is to go back to those partners and ask, where do the gaps exist? How can we help fill them with this facility and reduce the wait times that we see in the community for treatment services and stabilization?
Okay, so how about that South Central Foundation right down the street? I thought they were building a new building and expanding.
South Central Foundation has been the partner on looking at the pro forma for this concept, and I can't speak to their improvements that they're doing. I know they continue to do detox, but one of the things that we've seen is there is a lag time between detox and treatment in the community, and so this building could be a way for us to partner with those treatment providers to address those gaps.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Ms. Allard?
Hi, thank you. My question is, has anybody checked with the Department of Transportation state to find out where they're going with their plans?
Take that one, Mr. Chairman. So through the chair, Assemblymember Aller, as this relates to the Midtown Congestion Relief Project and the associated sub-projects like the 36th Avenue overpass, et cetera, there is a taking involved in that if and when that project moves forward, but it only impacts a portion of the parking lot. and does not impact the entire property. This is one of the few properties in the corridor that won't be acquired outright should that Midtown congestion project move forward.
I'm getting a little bit of different feedback from the state in regards to that, but I'll make sure I get the information and maybe we can figure out in a further discussion how they're going to approach it. Thank you.
Yeah, through the chair, we ran this proposal through the project team that's leading the Midtown congestion relief effort, and the project managers were the ones that provided us with that feedback.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Ms. Zalata?
Thank you. Does that information hold if it's if they go with the elevated option as well for the freeway there?
So through the chair, when we posed the question to the Midtown Congestion Relief project managers, we did not specify an alternative or an option. We just asked the question broadly whether or not the property was at risk by the Midtown Congestion Relief work, and we got the answer back that it would only require a portion of the parking lot for the project. They did not specify if that's for option A or B or C.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Constant?
Thank you. As many of you know, I have a long and challenging history with DOT, and I would offer that we should not avoid any plans we need to make because DOT has a hold, invisible or visible, on any property anywhere because they will sit and wait for 30 and 40 and 50 years until every one of us is dead before they move forward in their priority and time frame. And it's an unjust methodology that they use. It's practically criminal, and I'm looking forward to the day that a group of citizens decides to sue them for their abuses of neighborhoods in relationship to this corridor. So I would strongly suggest that we have a duty to proceed despite what DOT might tell us, because I find them to be the least credible people I have to deal with on a regular basis.
Thank you. I don't see anyone else in the queue. Go ahead, Jason.
Okay. And again, just a map of the property so everyone can visualize where it is. 36th and New Seward right there on the corner. So again, I wanted to come back to where we were at the very beginning. So last year, with all of the different shelters and buildings that we had, we were able to accommodate almost 700 individuals for our adult shelter capacity. And when you look at where we are now in COVID, that leaves us about 400 short. So just reiterating how much work we still have to do moving into the winter. If we all have a desire to ultimately move out of the Sullivan Arena and let that facility go back to its intended use. So again, just showing that. Even with the Alaska Club, and I apologize, I didn't correct that number. The Alaska Club should probably be closer to 150, and the America's Best Value Inn at 160. We're still going to be short. We still are going to have an unmet need of around 100 spaces. So even with the potential acquisition of these properties, we likely are not finished trying to figure out where do we go next. So just kind of raising that issue that there will likely still be further conversations about this as we move forward. And don't know if I saw Assemblymember Zalatel wanting to ask a question, so I'll wait to move on.
Thanks. Ms. Zalatel?
Thank you. Where does the permanent supportive housing project we've been talking about fit in with these numbers? Because that was proposed at 120 or 150. And wouldn't that take care of this potential gap if we get that up and going?
It's entirely possible, and I'll let Nancy comment a little bit more. But yes, it's entirely possible as we get that up and running. I think, as we have discussed, part of what we're dealing with is it is obviously July 1st, and trying to figure out what are we going to do for this winter. But I'll let Nancy expound on that a little bit.
Through the chair, yes, that's correct. And I wanted to just make the point that our gap right now is in shelter services because we don't have housing resources built out. And as many spaces as we can convert to rapid rehousing or permanent supported housing, that allows us to collect revenue and not have to pay 100% of the operations costs on municipal dollars. So those 150 would be included in these numbers.
Thanks. Mr. Gates?
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to ask about the Title 21 use classifications for the facilities on this list. I mean, we're heading as adult shelter capacity, but these are not all under the definition of homeless and transit shelters, right? Which is basically overnight. Some of these, and including the new one for America's Best Value Inn, are transitional living facilities. Does that include some of the others current facilities here, like Covenant House? Is that a transitional living facility as well? I just want to make sure we are looking at a list of both homeless transit shelters and transitional living facilities for clarification. But we're not including in this list for capacity limits the habilitative care and what the other one was.
Does someone from the administration want to handle that?
Sorry, this is Jason. Yes, I believe you have most of that right. I didn't catch the tail end, but I didn't hear anything I thought was wrong.
Let me clarify. This list does not include the habilitative care facilities, right?
Correct.
This list is homeless transit shelters uses and transitional living facility uses. Just those two uses.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton?
Okay, maybe what Dean's comment was help me out a little bit, but I guess as I see this, we would be buying 4 buildings to move the people from Sullivan into. And we're calling only one of them a homeless shelter, and that's the one on Tudor, and the other have different names. But the reality is the people at the Sullivan, we broadly labeled, these are the homeless. So if we move them anywhere else, they're still the homeless in these structures. And that's kind of, at least what I've been telling people is, no, that won't be a homeless shelter at Golden Lion. It's gonna be very different. It's gonna have different kind of people. Same thing with one on Spenard. That's not homeless. That's people with special supports and so on. The homeless shelter will be Tudor. But what we're really doing is taking homeless people and putting them, I know it's broad spectrum of who those people are and what their issues are, but we're taking homeless people and putting them into 4 different locations. So these will all be in the colloquial mind, homeless shelters, and some going to be feared. Tell me that's wrong.
I do believe that is wrong, and I will ask both Nancy, and I also believe that Jasmine Boyle with the coalition is on, and I might ask her to comment on a number of those questions as well, because we have worked closely with them in trying to figure out how do we do this and everything that they're working on. Nancy or Jasmine?
Oh, this is Nancy. I was holding for Jasmine. If she's on mute.
I am. I'm happy to respond. I was just thinking you might want to go first. Through the chair, this is Jasmine Boyle, the Executive Director of the Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness. To give you guys just a bit of background, the Coalition's Advisory Council, which is made up of subject matter experts, executive directors, and senior folks who run our social service and homeless service organizations around the community, we've been working for several months on a gap analysis, a comprehensive data review of what our supply and demand for homeless services in Anchorage are. We are going to be releasing that final product, which does include our priorities for the homeless response system in Anchorage for 2021 and beyond. We will be releasing that on July 13th and actually be bringing it to the Assembly Committee on Homelessness on July 15th. So we'll have more specific data to share. But frankly, we've been working with the municipality on this discussion for several weeks. They've included the advisory council chair, vice chair, and myself in these conversations. So there's a couple different pieces, and I'll provide some brief information and then be happy to answer questions. There's two different pieces of work at play when we talk about need in Anchorage. And one is, what did demand look like pre-COVID? I think that we've consistently seen a need for shelter beds that usually springs up in the winter months when we tend to see more people come indoors and more people in need of shelter services. So we've always had a bit of a capacity gap in our shelter system. We've certainly had a housing gap. We have had a dearth of affordable and available housing, particularly for our high vulnerability people, for years. And for single adults, that gap has grown for several years. So we know that we don't have enough housing services and units, particularly for adults who are vulnerable in our community. COVID is stretching that gap even wider. So the slide in front of you is the work of the Emergency Operations Center, Nancy Burke and myself, with our shelter providers around town during COVID. And the first piece of that work was to account for the change in spacing. You heard several people speak about this already today. The CDC, when COVID arrived, so to speak, in our homeless population, very quickly said you need to have 6 feet of distancing in all shelters. That, of course, changes capacity. You certainly heard from the administration that the intent is to maintain that spacing. We know that infectious disease does tend to hit congregate care settings, and this is wise beyond the pandemic. All of that to say, there was already a shortage of shelter beds and there was already a shortage of housing. The shelter bed shortage tended to be in the winter. With COVID, we anticipate that demand will only increase. We do not think homelessness is going to decrease in COVID. So our data is going to show you on the 15th very specific recommendations on the number of additional housing units we need and the number of additional shelter units we need. But that shelter data is exactly what you're looking at right now. It's not going to look any different than that. I think where the administration in these conversations about these 4 pieces of property is getting creative is looking at blending and saying, let's not just create shelter beds. Let's also create the opportunity to turn some of those spaces into more permanent or sustainable housing, because that's the end goal for all of us. So I think it's that play of trying to meet the short-term need, which we do expect to increase, but also the long-term feasibility of having enough housing available. I'll stop there and see if that covered the question asked and if there's any follow-up.
Is that back to me then?
Sure, go ahead if you have any follow-up, John.
I think it was somewhat helpful. I mean, so you'd have different people with different issues go to different buildings. How do you sort that out? You've got, I mean, is it clear when the hundreds of people at the Sullivan Arena are told to move? They get a invitation to a different location. How does that work?
This is Nancy, if you don't mind my jumping in here through the chair. That is a process that needs to be established. The coalition has a number of screening tools that are used that we can gauge somewhat of the level that people need, but we have to develop a system that would help us know which people go to which locations.
All right, thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Constant.
Thanks. I think Mr. Weddleton brings up an important point, that there's a perceptual issue, because that's what he was really talking about. People are just going to think these are Beans or Brother Francis shelter being recreated and the street near them. And what I see here are housing units that, in whatever timeline, short or midterm, start to become operating as these permanent supportive housing units. For the last several years, we've been raked over the coals for the fact that the plans we've been developing are impossible to achieve because they're necessitated on having housing available for people. And this is truly kind of a miracle of timing, that all of the plans we've been developing lead to this moment and this decision, and they're right. The opportunity, the option is right in front of us to achieve kind of the apotheosis of that vision, where 6 months ago, this was an impossible phenomenon, an impossible moment. Here we are now. We can actually house most of these individuals, not even congregate shelter. It'd be a very small portion of them in congregate shelter, but in permanent supportive housing units. And so this to me is the fulfillment of 10 and 15 years of effort, and especially 5 years of really strong effort to achieve a goal, which is to stop using shelter as an excuse for not taking care of the problem. Housing is the answer.
Thank you. Mr. Buckenstead, how many slides do you have left?
I believe just one more.
Okay, let's go ahead and go through that last slide, and then we'll call it good.
Okay. We did want to just briefly discuss again what we are working through is kind of the big piece is obviously the purchase, but there will obviously be annual operating costs that we need to make sure that not only is the administration, but the assembly and the community willing to fund year in and year out. So just wanted to give a preview of what we are looking at in terms of.
Jason, a quick interruption. Mr. Chair, I'd move to extend for 10 minutes.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any
opposition? Seeing none, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So just wanted to provide a brief preview of what we are looking at. Again, some of this is subject to change, but wanted to just kind of put this out there in terms of what we're seeing is in terms of annual operating costs that will be necessary from the municipality for these locations. And happy to answer any questions about that, or if members have questions, we will obviously have another work session next week, and happy to collect those and begin with those next week.
Thank you. Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you. Maybe this will be next week then, Jason, but this is, what is your initial proposal on where to find these operating revenues?
I mean, I think the biggest one is going to be the alcohol tax is going to be the big one, and then obviously there will be opportunity that where additional revenue will likely be coming in from the closing of the ML&P sale to Chugach, and the additional revenue that will be spun off from Anchorage's trust year in and year out. But those are the two big ones right now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Constant.
Thanks. So I've been in conversation with a number of people, and some of you might have heard me intimate about this, but that under the Medicaid waiver, if service provision is allowed in these locations, which would require a code change for these uses to allow behavioral health to be delivered, these operations with some modest investment in staffing to include a clinician who would write treatment plans, a skilled biller, and an IT person that can help engage electronic health records. Each of these places could be moved towards self-sustaining through revenue generation in a not too long amount of time. And so while we may be looking at the upfront costs of operating at this level from alcohol taxes or other revenues, if we're very smart about how we invest these dollars and put requirements on these operations, we could actually drive them towards self-sustainability in not too long of a time based on the transformation we've had in healthcare in the last 5 years. And I'll be talking more about that every time we talk.
Thank you. Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm kind of tracking on this operating cost idea too. So I'm assuming that this includes everything. This is the electricity, this is the program itself. It's everything that's involved in running these shelters and treatment centers. So you can correct me if I'm wrong on any of that. But my other question though is, wouldn't there still be the ability to charge some of these people for some of these services? I mean, there's going to be Medicaid potential. I'm assuming there could be permanent fund garnishment, or, you know, if they do happen to be working in some way at the same time, there could be a fee assessed. So anyway, I was just wondering if anybody's taken a look at the potential income that might come from this as well. Not just investment, but from the people that are taking advantage of the services themselves. Thanks.
Yes, through the chair, Assemblymember Kennedy. Yes, those are all things that we are taking into account when we're looking at these numbers. These are more the side that we are currently seeing that will be what is, I would say, short based on all of the other factors that we are looking at, Medicaid reimbursement, vouchers, things like that. So those are being taken into account with this, but there will obviously certainly be opportunities to continue to refine that and see if there are ways that we can drive down what would be the annual operating expenses that the municipality is responsible for.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Buckenstadt, the two questions. One, for next year at least, could any of these operating costs be paid for by CARES Act funds? And then, second, you know, there was a group of private institutions that announced that they were going to dedicate $40 million to homelessness over the next 5 years. It seems like this would be very much in keeping with what they want to do. Have you been in contact with them about them chipping into these operating costs?
To answer your last question first, yes, I think that is going to be the other area that we continue to explore, as obviously there are a lot of our philanthropic partners that are very interested in helping us move the needle on all of these issues and have, as you mentioned, you know, said that they're willing to contribute. So that will obviously be a part of our conversation, at least in the very near term for the rest of this year, potentially, and into next year. And then your question about the CARES Act, I don't think that the way that the CARES Act guidance is currently written, that we would be allowed to use the money going into next year based on the Treasury guidance. It needs to be spent by the end of this year, December 30th.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton.
So no one's broached the Oliva property. Is there any thoughts on using CARES Act money to buy that to help repair the damage down at 3rd Avenue?
Yes, please. Oh, sorry.
I will say this is Jason, through the chair, Assemblymember Weddleton. I believe a number of those conversations are continuing to happen, and I think we would likely be able to go into a lot more detail next week on that specific topic. Or that specific
thank you.
topic, I should say.
Thank you. Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to go back to the funding and the what is eligible. If we meld these ideas of having a homeless shelter with treatment centers and that, is there potential that we would actually only have to, we would end up prorating part of those CARES Act funds to only cover the amount for homelessness? Or is there actually a provision in CARES Act funding that allows for setting up and beginning treatment centers? I just, I'm trying to make sure we're not kind of muddying the waters here and then get kind of caught with half of the funding on it being eligible for some of these properties, and maybe some of the funding not being eligible because the property is being used for things outside of what CARES allows. So comment on that, please.
Absolutely. That is a great question. And through the chair, Assemblymember Kennedy, it is one of the reasons why at the very beginning and within the ordinance, we do have language in there that says, that discusses the ability to lease the property or lease to own, because I'll just remind everyone, as part of the stipulation or stipulated agreement with the ML&P sale, there was $15 million set aside for the construction, renovation, build out of a Alaska Center for Treatment. And I think ultimately our goal is to use that funding for the treatment center. However, based on the timeline we are working on and the need to try to get the property under contract, we don't have access to that funding yet. So that is one of the reasons why we say lease with the potential purchase at some point in the future when we do have access to that, to actually prevent kind of the muddying of the waters of the CARES Act with regards to a treatment center.
Well, thank you. Mr. Chair, can I follow up on that?
Sure.
Thank you. Jason, when you mentioned the money from the sale of ML&P, I was under the assumption that that would be a newly created facility, or could potentially be a renovated, already existing facility that would allow us to be in compliance with that? Or
Yes.
Straighten me out on it. Thanks. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So that takes us to the end of our time today. Like I said, we have a second work session planned on July 10th. So we will continue going through questions and answers and any new materials at that time. Thanks, Jason and the administration, for the presentation. I will go ahead and end this work session. Thanks, everyone.